dear participants, we will be moving on to the next session. It's the second session of today's certificate course, and we have Dr. M. Sanjeeb Hossain, who is a teaching fellow at the School of Law, Warwick University since 2019. And he did his Bachelor of Laws from BRAC University and Master of Laws in Criminology and Criminal Justice from University of Oxford. And he has also worked as a researcher to the Chief Prosecutor at the International Crimes Tribunal of Bangladesh. He would be delivering his lecture on Bangladesh 1971, Acts of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. So without any further ado, I would request the speaker to deliver his lecture.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's good.
Good, great, nice. Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Center for the Study of Genocide and Justice for inviting me to speak today. Obviously, as you know, the title of today's lecture is Bangladesh 1971, Acts of Genocide and Crimes Against Humanity. Bangladesh's emergence as a sovereign nation state at the expense of countless of victims who basically perished during the Liberation War of 1971. I'm sure you know, I mean, the UN Secretary General at the time, U Thant, he basically described the events of 1971 as a terrible blot on the page of human history. So condensing this history into a 35-minute lecture is not going to be easy, but I'm going to try my best. So just to sort of give you a sense of structure, I'm going to divide the lecture into two broad parts. The first part, I'll just cover the nature and the extent of the atrocities that were committed by the Pakistan Army and its local auxiliary forces. And then, of course, in the second part, I want to talk a little bit more about the local auxiliaries themselves. And I'll finish off by very briefly touching upon some of the initiatives that were taken to bring the perpetrators to justice. So that's the basic structure of it. So from the very beginning of Bangladesh's liberation war, there were serious concerns that crimes were being committed by the Pakistan Army and its local auxiliary forces. But what's important to acknowledge is, and it's something we need to acknowledge further, is that these crimes were committed at the scale of international crimes. And that's a very significant difference we need to understand. So it's not just that crimes were being committed, but international crimes were being committed. And the groups that were particularly targeted included leaders and supporters of the Awami League, Hindus, Bengali academics, women, girls, and the Bengali populace at large. And they all succumbed to murder, rape, torture, abductions, forced conversions, deportation, etc., etc. Now, there are countless sort of sources that actually substantiate these claims, And these sources include, let's say, for instance, eyewitness testimonies, newspaper reports written by not just local reporters, but international foreign correspondents who actually covered the war. Sources also include, let's say, the reports of proceedings of legislative bodies, of judicial bodies, of foreign states, and other international organizations. So one thing that is clear from the knowledge that we've gained from all these sources is that international crimes, such as crimes against humanity and genocide, they did take place in 1971. The other fact that comes up very clearly from these sources is that the primary victims of these international crimes were the Bengali populace, and the perpetrators of these international crimes were the Pakistan Army and their local auxiliaries, and I'm sure you know their names, the Rajakars, the Al-Bodur, Al-Shams, and many of these members actually came from a political party known as Jamaat-e-Islami. So I mean, in order to sort of truly appreciate the international crimes that were committed in 1971, we really have to start with Operation Searchlight. And this is something you've all heard about and you know about. And what I want to do is, I want to refer to a quote I came across a book called Bangladesh, the Unfinished Revolution. So this book is basically written by a renowned American journalist. His name is Lawrence Lifshulz. And a part of this book is about Major Abu Tahir, a Bengali officer, and he was a commander of the elite special services group of the Pakistan Army. So Tahir basically escaped from West Pakistan to command the largest sector of the Bangladesh forces during the war. And Tahir recalls the instructions that were given from the headquarters of the Pakistan Army on the 25th of March, 1971. So I'll just read out the quote for you. "The barbaric purpose of the military junta was not unknown to us who were in West Pakistan, when from general headquarters of the Pakistan Army, the message went out, burn everything, kill everyone in sight." So that's the nature, that was sort of like what set the foundations for Operation Searchlight. Now, many of you must have heard about Archer Blood. In fact, the first set of documents that recorded the atrocities of the Pakistan Army were a set of dissenting cables that were wired by Archer Blood. Now, who's Archer Blood? He is based in Dhaka at the time. He's serving as the US Consul General. And on the 28th of March, 1971, he sends out a series of cables, the subject of which was selective genocide. So the fact that, the genocide is actually taking place, it was actually documented at the very eve of, the crackdown. And if you read that cable, it's widely accessible on the internet. If you actually take a look at that cable, it says, "Here in Dhaka, we are mute and horrified witnesses to a reign of terror by the Pakistan military. Evidence constitutes to mount that the martial law authorities have a list of Awami League supporters whom they are systematically eliminating by seeking them out in their homes and shooting them down, etc., etc., etc." So, and he finishes off the cable saying, "The full horror of the Pakistani military atrocities will come to light sooner or later." Now, obviously, the Pakistan Army really tried to prevent the news of the atrocities from being shared with the outside world. And to that end, they tried to do something that was kind of stupid and naive. So what they did was they rounded up all the foreign journalists that were present at the time in Dhaka, and they confined them inside Dhaka's Hotel Intercontinental. And most of these foreign journalists were actually expelled from, the then East Pakistan or Bangladesh on the 27th of March, 1971. Now, only a few journalists managed to stay inside the country. So one of them was Simon Dring. I'm sure you've heard about Simon Dring. So Simon Dring was a reporter working for the Daily Telegraph at the time. And he basically hid inside the lobby, he hid inside the kitchen, the rooftop of the Hotel Intercontinental for 32 hours to avoid being expelled from the country. And in the next few days, Simon was basically accompanied by another, a French journalist. He was a photographer. His name was Michael Laurent, and he was working for the Associated Press. So together, Simon Dring and Michael Laurent, they spent the next few days roaming around the streets of Dhaka, and they went beyond Dhaka as well, and they witnessed firsthand the brutalities that were actually taking place. And many of these accounts were basically published by the Daily Telegraph on the 30th of March. And another similar report, which was published on that same day, basically said, it basically gave us a description of, the atrocities that were committed at Dhaka University, for instance. The report read, "Caught completely by surprise, some 200 students were killed in Iqbal Hall, the headquarters of the militantly anti-government students' union. 2 days later, bodies were smoldering in burnt out rooms. Others were scattered outside, more floated in a nearby lake. An art student lay sprawled across his easel. So, I mean, the depictions were obviously quite gruesome and gory. Now, as I've said before, the Pakistan Army systematically targeted Bengali students and academics, the leadership of the Band Awami League, the Hindu religious minority. And one of the first targets of the Pakistan Army was obviously the Dhaka University, because it was the intellectual hub of the region, and it had basically been the haven of multiple student-led movements against the exploitative policies and actions of the government of West Pakistan. So there was an American citizen who was basically evacuated to Karachi on the 4th of April in 1971. So this is after Operation Searchlight. And he was basically carrying with him a 24-page account of the massacre that was ongoing in Bangladesh. So throughout the entirety of March 1971, this American citizen was residing inside Bangladesh, and he basically confirmed the killings of at least 32 professors and heads of departments. This is in March 1971, not, and during Operation Searchlight. And some of these professors, they'd been picked up from their homes and they'd been shot afterwards. There was a Reuters correspondent, his name was Howard Witten, and he reported that, members of, the Awami League were shot like dogs. And then, of course, there was Adhi Chandra De. So Adhi Chandra De is basically a Hindu boy who was 7 years old on the night of March 25, 1971. And his entire family was murdered in cold blood by the Pakistan Army because of his father. Now, who's his father? His father is Madhusudhan De, who owned a restaurant inside Dhaka University where the students gathered for, political discussions and everything. So you know about Madhusudhan De. He was affectionately called Modhuda by those who knew him. And so Adhi Chandra De, he's a living witness to all the killings of his, family members. And he basically recalled 6 to 7 soldiers had gotten into our house and they started destroying all our belongings. Ranjitda rushed to the spot and said, Reena, hold up your hands. As soon as he said it, the soldiers turned back and shot him. The bullet pierced my brother's chest and came out through his neck and then hit the cheek of Ranu Didi. After that, the military shot my Bodhi. She was pregnant then. They then snatched the earrings of my Bodhi from her ears. When the military aimed their gun to shoot my father, my mother ran to him and stood in front of him, spreading her hands. She begged the military, "You've ruined me. You've ruined my son, my daughter-in-law. Don't kill him. I beg for his life." They did not pay heed to their appeal. Instead, they ordered to go away. They tried to drag her forcibly, but failed. Lastly, out of rage, they cut both her hands with a bayonet. Her hands got totally dispersed and were just hanging on the skin. Even after she died, they shot her body several times in front of my father. Father also got shot. Both bodies were wet with blood. So what I'm trying to say is that it was evident that the Pakistani military authorities were applying brute force to suppress the Bengali population into subjugation. And, so for instance, there was Henrik van der Heijden, who was basically an economist of the Pakistan division of the IBRD. And he basically, there was a book called 1,000 Mailais, a World Bank study on Bangladesh. So in that book, Heijden, because he had toured Bangladesh in June 1971, he basically described Khulna, which was, it's in the southwestern region of Bangladesh. And he basically said that Khulna looked like a town from the Second World War that had undergone strategic. That is what Khulna looked like, So what was the goal of the Pakistan Army, I mean, for the longest time, it was, what was the official goal of this, organization, let's say? But it remained undisclosed until the publication of a 4-page report called Genocide, which was published in the Sunday Times on the 13th of July, 1971. And this report was written by someone called Anthony Mascarenhas. He was a Pakistani journalist who was basically treated as a guest by the Pakistan Army. And with the assistance of the Pakistan Army, Anthony Mascarenhas had toured East Pakistan to basically get a picture of the ongoing military campaign. Now, it's really important to understand the context and importance of this report written by Anthony Mascarenhas, because the BBC recently described this report as one of the most influential pieces of South Asian journalism of the past half century. So Mascarenhas basically summarized the policy that defined Yahya Khan's strategy. So the policy had three elements. The first one was that the Bengalis, they had basically proved themselves unreliable. They're absolutely unreliable and they have to be ruled by West Pakistanis. Number two, the Bengalis, they have to be re-educated along Islamic lines. So you need to carry out the Islamization of the masses. And why do you need to do it from the mind of the Pakistani army? You need to do it to eliminate any secessionist tendencies and provide a strong religious bond with West Pakistan. And finally, the third element of the policy was that, you know, when the Hindus, when they've been eliminated by death or let's say flight, you know, their property will be utilized as a golden carrot to win over the base for erecting administrative and political structures in the future. Now, when I was so now you sort of gain a sense. I hope you've gotten a sense of what the policies of the Pakistan Army were. Now, when I was sort of doing my doctoral research a number of years ago, I came across an interview of an American construction worker who was based in Bangladesh in 1971. His name was Fritz Blankenship. So when Blankenship was working in Chittagong, he basically maintained a close relationship with members of the Pakistan Army. You know, he got to interact with them and mingle with them. And so this person, he gave an interview to the US television channel called CBS News Channel. And he was asked if he could describe how he thought, you know, what the thought process of some of the Pakistani officers were, you know, what did they think like? So I actually saw the footage of Fritz Blankenship's interview. And so he says, one in particular was Major Kamal. So this is a Pakistani officer, Major Kamal. This man, we sat and talked to him for about 2 hours. And this guy bragged about what he was going to do when the war was over, when it was finished. He said, it's bloody fun. It's bloody good fun, this war is. And he was up in the air and he made statements like, when this is over, no Bengali will drive a car. Only foreigners and West Pakistanis, they will drive cars. And there was a club called the Chittagong Club. So Major Kamal says, no Bengali will be allowed in the club. No dogs or Bengalis will be allowed in the club. And he went on to say, I'm going to have the most beautiful Bengali mistress in Chittagong, and all my troops will have one. And then Fritz Blankenship, he finishes, you know, he's mortified. He's saying it was sickening to listen to this man. So one interesting question that comes to mind is, I mean, what were the superpowers of the world? What were they up to when all this is taking place, right? So, you know, the superpowers of the world, they're basically divided on the question of the liberation of the Bengalis and the existence of an independent Bangladesh, right? So on the one hand, you have India and the Soviet Union, who basically recognize the political aspirations of the Bengalis. And on the other hand, you have the United States government that came to the aid of the Pakistanis, you know, the Pakistan Army. So, you know, there are good reasons to believe that although the victory of Bengalis would have probably happened anyways, but had it not been for the direct military support of the Indian government and the diplomatic support of the Soviet Union at the UN Security Council, the Bengalis' struggle for liberation would have turned on to a long, drawn struggle, you know, wishful thinking. Hopefully we would have won, but you know, how do we really know? Now, so during the course of this war, 10 million people obviously fled across the border into India as refugees. So you have the US Senator William Saxby, who basically visited the refugee camps in India, and he offered a very, very intriguing and thought-provoking observation. He said, you and I know when we visited these refugee camps, I'm sure Senator Kennedy saw the same thing. There were no young girls in those camps. You didn't see one. And now the truth is that they were kidnapped, held in brothels, held in camps, that they were murdered, and the extent of the atrocity is not known to the world. So this is how things were basically progressing. Now, on the 3rd of January in 1972, you have Pravda, which was basically a prominent, you know, the most prominent newspaper published by the Soviet Union. And it basically reported a loss of 3 million lives at the hands of the Pakistan Army. And there was someone who was a very renowned figure. His name was Reverend Kentaro Buma, who was the Asian Relief Secretary of the World Council of Churches. And Kentaro Buma, he learned firsthand the state of affairs during he was on a 2-week mission in war-torn Bangladesh. So he was in Bangladesh in January 1972. So towards the middle of January, he organized a press conference. And it was at that press conference, Reverend Kentaro Buma informed that 200,000 women had been raped by the Pakistani soldiers. And they were now being ostracized by the Bengali sort of Muslim community. Now, Buma, he then at that press conference went on to inform that the government of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was trying to counter the situation by honoring the rape victims as biranganas, or national heroines. Now, Reverend Buma's estimates, the number 200,000 rapes, that was based on government estimates. In reality, how many females were sexually abused at the hands of the Pakistan Army may never be known. There was a war rehabilitation organization that was led by Justice K.M. Subhan, and that was formed in war-torn Bangladesh in 1972. There was someone called Malika Khan. She was a social worker who was assisting in the rehabilitation process. And, she said that, we don't really have lists of who was raped simply because of societal, pressures. And, Malika herself had read depositions of more than 5,000 women. She herself read 5,000 depositions of women who had been sexually exploited. And then, of course, there was Jeffrey Davis. Jeffrey Davis is a young man. He's a medical graduate from Australia. And he arrives in Bangladesh in 1972 with the support of the International Planned Parenthood and the UNFPA and the WHO. So Jeffrey Davis, he basically stayed in Bangladesh for 6 months. And during that time, he conducted numerous abortions, and at the same time offered training on how to properly, safely carry out an abortion. And his experiences led him to conclude that the government estimate of 200,000 rapes was a conservative estimate. So it was probably actually much more. So Jeffrey Davis, this medical graduate from Australia, he did something interesting. When he was in Bangladesh, he also interviewed many of the, Pakistani prisoners of war who were inside a prison in Kumilla. Some of them were in Kumilla. And these interviews revealed that these Pakistani soldiers, they were under instructions by the top brass of the Pakistan Army that a good Muslim is duty-bound to fight anyone other than his father. So this, prompted them to impregnate as many Bengali women as they could so that there would be a whole generation of children in East Pakistan born with West Pakistani blood. So, you know, you know, taking all these things into account, there was a report published in the Times, and you have this US official admitting that what the Bengalis basically endured, what the Bengalis basically endured was the most incredible, calculated thing since the days of the Nazis in Poland. And I came across a recent publication that was published by BD News 24. Basically, it revealed the presence of at least 618 mass graves throughout Bangladesh resulting from these atrocities. So, I mean, the point I'm trying to make is this. I mean, drawing clear lines between right and wrong isn't always an easy task when you're sort of trying to interpret modern day wars, right? But many observers were definitely able to take a clear position about the war that took place in 1971, which resulted in the creation of Bangladesh. There's no ambiguity about this. There's no, ambiguity about what was right and what was wrong about this. Now, so it's true that there are some academics who have challenged the Bengalis' claim to victimhood. So, for instance, you have the Indian author Sharmila Bose, right, who wrote the book called Dead Reckoning, Memories of 1971 Bangladesh War. And Bose, in her book, challenged the criminal image and portrayed a humane side of the Pakistan Army. She also placed emphasis on the acts of violence against Biharis by Bengalis and argued that the number of Bengali victims was much less than that has been claimed. So, but Bose's work has been evaluated and critiqued. And Bose's research methodologies and findings, they've been described as deeply problematic. They've been critiqued in the works of Srinath Raghavan, Nayanika Mukherjee, Naeem Mohaiman. They've all adequately critiqued her book and her findings. Now, another very, very famous journalist, American journalist, his name is Arnold Zeitling, who basically served as the bureau chief of the Associated Press during 1971. And he also critiqued Sharmila Bose's book, and he described Bose's effort as ingenuous in terms of artless and naive. And Arnold Zeitling said that it was a distortion of history instead of being a revision of history. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to negate the fact that violence was committed against the Biharis by Bengalis and vice versa. And they took place in scattered but nevertheless real instances of communal riots, mob violence, reprisals. But if for instance, if you take a look at a report published by the International Commission of Jurists, the report actually acknowledged the directives and efforts of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and the Awami League in trying to contain the violence against the Bihari community during the war and after the war. And in the immediate aftermath of the war, Mujib Bahini, for instance, was absolutely praised by the foreign press for its role in protecting the Biharis from reprisals. So with that, I'd just like to move on, and I'm towards the end of my lecture. I mean, I just want to sort of talk a little bit about the local collaborators, right? So, obviously, as we know, the war went on for 9 months, and the Pakistan military, they found an ally in a group of local Bengalis, mainly belonging to, the right-wing party, which was the East Pakistan Jamaat-e-Islami. And we all know that they commanded negligible popular support throughout the zone, throughout East Pakistan, but they contributed significantly to the formation of the Rajakars al-Bodor al-Shams that were the auxiliary forces of the Pakistan Army. And they also played a key role in the formation of the peace committees, that facilitated the above mentioned, these auxiliary forces. Now, in June 1971, it was basically General Tika Khan, the governor of East Pakistan, who basically issued the East Pakistan Ordinance of 1971 for the purposes of providing the constitution of a voluntary force called the Rajakars. And by July 1971, the Pakistan Army had recruited at least 5,000 persons. They were paid and obviously the numbers went up substantially later on. And these Rajakars, they were paid 3 rupees a day. They received 15 days of training on how to shoot a police Lee Enfield rifle. And they were given, and subsequently they were given enhanced powers comparable to members of the Pakistan Army. And they performed security checks. They guided the Pakistani troops to the homes of, supporters of the Army League, etc., etc. And I was looking back at some of the archived material that I have, and I read a letter by someone called Bodiul Alam. So his name is Bodiul Alam, and he was the secretary of the Peace Committee of Chittagong during 1971. And he wrote a letter to the Pakistan authorities, and he wrote on how to eliminate the miscreants and stop the anti-state activities in the city involving the Rajakars. So these miscreants that Bodiul Alam is referring to were, the general masses of East Pakistan fighting to liberate Bangladesh. So, and then of course, let's not forget Ghulam Azam himself, who was basically the Amir of the East Pakistan Jamaat-e-Islami, who was one of the central figures of the key leadership, of the auxiliary forces. And during a relentless yet ineffective campaign to sway the sentiments of the Bengali people against the liberation of Bangladesh, Ghulam Azam and his cohorts argued that Islam was being endangered through the Bengali struggle for liberation. And during a press conference, which was held in Karachi, Ghulam Azam praised the role of the Razakars, saying, a good Muslim cannot be a supporter of the Bangladesh movement. The one-minded patriotic citizens are working to eliminate the separatists of East Pakistan. The Rajakars are doing a very good job. So that's Ghulam Azam and how he felt about the Rajakar Bahini. And then of course, we now also know that the Rajakars were divided into 2 wings, the Al-Badr and the Al-Shams. And those two were also very notorious organizations. And in the second week of December 1971, when the victory of the liberation forces was pretty much inevitable, the Jamaat-e-Islami and the Al-Badr and members of the Islami Chhatra Sangho, they went out on a calculated killing mission targeting eminent Bengali intellectuals. And if you take a look at the report by the International Commission of Jurists that was published in 1972, you'll see that these Al-Badrs, they carried out their raids in the nighttime. The victims were led away blindfolded at gunpoint, and they never came back. Many of them were taken to the Dhaka College of a physical education building. And there was a janitor at that college who basically stated that hundreds of people, all nicely dressed, they were tied up, and we could hear the screaming all the time from those rooms. And and we all know that these killings basically crippled the Bengali intelligentsia. And Ahmed Ziauddin, who basically founded the Bangladesh Center for Genocide Studies in Belgium, he said that the Al-Badr was very much like it was a Gestapo-like organizations. Now, these gory descriptions may be surprising to you, but I urge you not to be surprised. And as I near the end of this lecture, I want to refer back to 2 incidents from history, and hopefully they'll help you understand the mindset of the leadership of the Pakistan Army. So in 1967, President Ayub Khan, in his autobiography, Friends Not Masters, he described the Bengalis of East Pakistan as an ethnic group that possessed the inhibitions of downtrodden races. And he said that Bengalis, they were not psychologically adjusted to the requirements of the newborn freedom. And he said that Bengalis, they suffer from popular complexes, exclusiveness, suspicion, a sort of defensive aggressiveness. And he felt that these Bengali traits, they originated from Hindu cultural linguistic influences. And he went on to say some other bad things. So that's one incident. And the second incident took place in November 1970. So as you know, in November 1970, it basically, one of the deadliest recorded cyclones of modern times took place in East Pakistan at the time, and it swept away several 100,000 people. And President Yahya Khan, on his return from a state visit to China, he stopped over at the Dhaka airport. So he's at the airport, Dhaka airport. And he didn't make a single trip to any of the affected areas. So Arnold Zeitling, the renowned American journalist, he recalls, he was there at the Dhaka airport. He recalls, I remember sitting closely in the VIP room of the Dhaka airport. Yahya sat in that little room, and next to him was a little Bengali press officer who was actually shivering with fright. And I remember Yahya turned to him and growled, "I don't like you." It was as blatant and clear as that. He just said, "I don't like you." So it was, I mean, based on the previous lectures you've heard today and the day before, I mean, obviously, we know that it was cultural domination. It was the economic exploitation that was suffered by the Bengalis at the hands of the Punjabi sort of dominated West Pakistan that led to calls for independence and the ultimate backlash by the Pakistan Army. And it was during this conflict that the Pakistan Army and its local auxiliaries inflicted mass atrocities against the Bengali people. And the commission of these atrocities resulted in 3 distinct attempts to bring those who committed those atrocities to account, to bring them to justice. So we know the 2 major ones. So for instance, we know about the ones that took place in the early 1970s under the Bangladesh Collaborators Special Tribunals Order of 1972, right? And then of course, we also know about the ongoing justice process in Bangladesh through the International Crimes Tribunals, which was basically formed through the International Crimes Tribunals Act of 1973. But I suppose there's a lesser known initiative. And those were basically the first efforts of seeking justice. And they took place through informal justice systems during the war and immediately after the war. And they were basically called the Gono Adalots. They were the people's courts, which basically operated in various parts of Bangladesh during 1971, and while the war was actually being fought. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of the justice initiatives that we really haven't been able to shed much light on, and it's something that we really need to do. But then, of course, to sort of finish off, obviously, we have the International Crimes Tribunals, and the fact remains that the ICTs, the ongoing ICTs, they will be remembered as the last sort of definitive attempt to deliver justice to the victims of mass atrocities, whether they be genocide or crimes against humanity. So that's that. That's pretty much all I have to say from my end. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we will quickly move on to the participants if they have any questions or any queries.
Hello.
Yes.
সঞ্জীব হোসেন স্যারকে অনেক ধন্যবাদ, সুন্দর লেকচার দিয়েছেন। আমার একটি বিষয় হচ্ছে যে আমরা যখন জেনোসাইডের সংজ্ঞাগুলোকে দেখি, সেই জেনোসাইডের সংজ্ঞাগুলোর মধ্যে একটা গ্রুপের সঙ্গে আর একটা গ্রুপে ইন্টেন্ড করার একটা বড় ধরনের প্রবণতা থাকে। অনেক সময় আমরা দেখি যে স্টেট এখানে খুব ভালো একটা রোল প্লে করে, কিন্তু 1971 জেনোসাইডের ক্ষেত্রে আপনি যে লেকচারটা দিচ্ছিলেন সেখানে আপনি লোকাল যারা পারপেট্রেটরস তাদেরকে আপনি যুক্ত করার চেষ্টা করেছেন বা বলেছেন যে দে আর অল ক্রিয়েটিং দ্য ম্যাস অ্যাট্রোসিটিস। সো যদি এরকম দেখা যায় যে হলোকস্টের সময় বা অন্যান্য অনেক জেনোসাইডের ক্ষেত্রে দেখা গেছে যে সেখানে একটা গোষ্ঠী বিশেষ করে যারা মার্কস হ্যালো হ্যালো
হ্যাঁ, নাহিয়াম সালসাবিল একটু এখানে আনমিউট ছিলেন, এই কারণে কোশ্চেনটা মাঝখানে ডিসরাপ্টেড হয়ে গেছে। আপনি কন্টিনিউ করেন।
আচ্ছা, বিষয়টা হচ্ছে যে ইন্টেন্ট আসলে এখানে পাকিস্তান মিলিটারি আর্মিদের ইন্টেন্ট যদি সরাসরি টোটাল বাঙালিদেরকে ডিস্ট্রয় করার থেকে থাকে, একটা হচ্ছে একটা গ্রুপকে ডিস্ট্রয় করে ফেলা, যেটা আপনি আপনার বক্তব্যের মধ্যে বলছেন বাংলাদেশ আওয়ামী লীগ বা আওয়ামী সমর্থিত পার্সনদেরকে, যদি সেরকম হয়ে থাকে পলিটিক্যাল জায়গা থেকে যদি এরকম হয়ে থাকে, তাহলে সেটাকে কি জেনোসাইডের আওতায় আনা যাবে কি?
অবশ্যই। আপনি যদি আপনি কি আমাদের ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ক্রাইমস ট্রাইব্যুনালস অ্যাক্ট 1973 ওই আইনটা কি দেখার সুযোগ কখনো হয়েছে?
যে আমি ঢাকা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের জেনোসাইড স্টাডিজে রিসার্চ অ্যাসোসিয়েট হিসেবে কাজ করছি, এটা হচ্ছে আমার একটা কিউরিয়াস, যে যেহেতু আপনি বক্তব্য দিচ্ছেন।
রাইট। এখন তাহলে ব্যাপারটা যেটা, ওকে নাইস, তাহলে যেটা দাঁড়াচ্ছে, আপনি যদি আমাদের জেনোসাইডের ডেফিনিশনটা দেখেন, ওখানে তো অবভিয়াসলি ওখানে কিছু প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপ আছে, তাই না? জেনোসাইডের পুরো ব্যাপারটাই তো ইট ইজ অ্যাবসলিউটলি রিলায়েন্ট অন এ নাম্বার অফ প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপস, তাই না? এখন আপনি যদি খোঁজার চেষ্টা করেন যে প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপসগুলি কি, তাহলে ন্যাশনাল গ্রুপ, এথনিক গ্রুপ, রেশিয়াল গ্রুপ, রিলিজিয়াস গ্রুপ অর পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ, রাইট? এখন যখন আমি আওয়ামী লীগের নেতা কর্মীদের কথা বলেছি, তখন অবভিয়াসলি তারা ওই পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপের আন্ডারে কিন্তু পড়বে, বিকজ আমাদের ডেফিনেশন অফ জেনোসাইডে পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ ইজ এ প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপ আর কি। এবং জেনোসাইড তো শুধু আওয়ামী লীগের মেম্বারদের বেলায় সীমাবদ্ধ ছিল না, এটা তো হিন্দুদের বেলায় প্রযোজ্য ছিল, বিকজ দে ওয়ার এ প্রোটেক্টেড রিলিজিয়াস গ্রুপ, তাই না? আবার বেঙ্গলিজ এট লার্জ তাদের বেলাও ছিল, কারণ বেঙ্গলিজ হচ্ছে একটা এথনিক গ্রুপ। তাহলে এখানে যদি আমরা তিনটা গ্রুপ যদি আইডেন্টিফাই করি, তাহলে বেঙ্গলিজ তারা এথনিক গ্রুপ হিসেবে প্রোটেক্টেড, তারপরে হচ্ছে রিলিজিয়াস গ্রুপ হচ্ছে হিন্দুস, এবং ফাইনালি আওয়ামী লীগ নেতাকর্মী যারা পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ আর কি। তো এইটা আর কি। আর আর আপনার কি আর কি প্রশ্ন ছিল? বুঝাতে পেরেছি?
আমার প্রশ্ন নেই, সেটা হচ্ছে আসলে আমরা যখন 1948 এর যে কনভেনশন, সেখানে কিন্তু সরাসরি পলিটিক্যাল যে পার্টির কথা, সেখানে যেটা বলা হচ্ছে ন্যাশনাল ইথিক্যাল রেসিয়াল ও রিলিজিয়াস গ্রুপ। এখন 1973 তে যে ট্রাইব্যুনালে পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপের বিষয়টা আসলো, সেটা আপনার কাছ থেকে এখন আমি ভালোভাবে পরিষ্কার হলাম, যেহেতু আমাদের 1948 এর যে
This is an excellent question. This is an excellent question. আচ্ছা, this is a really good question. এটার জন্য একটা জিনিস যেটা আপনাকে দেখতে হবে, যে আমাদের যে জেনোসাইড কনভেনশন যেটা আপনি 1948 এর কথা বললেন, এটার ড্রাফটিং হিস্ট্রিটা কি ছিল, এবং এটা নিয়ে আমি ব্যাপক পড়াশোনা করেছি। এবং এটা আমরা ওই যে বেসিক্যালি যেটা দেখা যাচ্ছে, এটা ঠিক আপনি যেটা বলছেন যে জেনোসাইড কনভেনশনে প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপে কিন্তু 1948 এর কিন্তু পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ নাই, এটা ঠিক কথা। আবার আমাদের 1973 এর একটা আছে। এখন তাহলে এটা কেমনে হলো? আপনি যদি ড্রাফটিং হিস্ট্রিতে ফেরত যান, তাহলে দেখবেন যে পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ কিন্তু যখন নেগোসিয়েশন হচ্ছে, ইনফ্যাক্ট জেনোসাইডের যে অরিজিনাল যে ডেফিনিশন, যখন রাফায়েল লেমকিন যখন এটা প্রস্তাবনা দিচ্ছেন, তখন পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ ইজ ডেফিনেটলি এ প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপ। এখন তাহলে কোয়েশ্চেন হচ্ছে গিয়ে, আলটিমেটলি যখন জেনোসাইড কনভেনশনটা ফাইনালাইজ করা হলো, আমাদের পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপটা বাদ পড়ে গেল কেমনে? এটা সিম্পল হচ্ছে ভোটাভুটির কারণে। কিছু কিছু পাওয়ারফুল রাষ্ট্র তারা চাচ্ছে না যে পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ এটার মধ্যে ডেফিনিশন, এমন না যে কোনো নরমেটিভ পার্সপেক্টিভ থেকে, যে আমি একদম থিওরিটিক্যালি বিশ্বাস করি না যে পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ এখানে থাকবে না। এটা হচ্ছে কনভিনিয়েন্স, যে সবচেয়ে যত বেশি মানুষকে দিয়ে জেনোসাইড কনভেনশন সই করানো যায়, রাজি করানো যায়, সেই জন্য পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপকে তারা বাদ দিয়ে দিতে বাধ্য হয়েছে। কিন্তু আপনি যদি লেজিসলেটিভ হিস্ট্রিটা দেখেন, একদম শেষ পর্যন্ত পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ কিন্তু একটা প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপ হিসেবে ছিল, জাস্ট ভোটাভুটি শেষে লাস্টে গিয়ে এটা বাদ পড়ে গেছে। এটা কোনো নরমেটিভ কারণে বাদ পড়ে যায় নাই, কনভিনিয়েন্সের কারণে বাদ পড়ে গেছে। তো এটা হচ্ছে একটা বিষয়। আরেকটা যেটা খুব গুরুত্বপূর্ণ, যেটা আমাদের আলোচনার মধ্যে মাঝে মাঝে আমরা মিস করে যাই, সেটা হচ্ছে গিয়ে আপনি যদি এই যে ইউনাইটেড নেশনস এর যে জেনারেল অ্যাসেম্বলি, মানে সব রাষ্ট্রের যে জেনারেল অ্যাসেম্বলি, ওদের একটা রেজলিউশন ছিল, এটা সম্ভবত 1948 অথবা 1947, আমি চেক করে আমার বলতে হবে। ওখানে ইউনাইটেড নেশনস এর যে জেনারেল অ্যাসেম্বলি যেই জেনোসাইডের ডেফিনিশন দিচ্ছে এবং প্রোটেক্টেড গ্রুপগুলিকে যে আইডেন্টিফাই করছে, সেখানে কিন্তু পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ ছিল এবং সেই রেজলিউশন কিন্তু এখনো বহাল, সেটা কিন্তু এখনো আছে। ওকে, আচ্ছা, তাহলে জেনোসাইড কনভেনশন আলাপটা হলো, ওই ইউনাইটেড নেশনস এর জেনারেল অ্যাসেম্বলি আলোচনা হলো। এখন আমরা আসি আমাদের নিজেদের আইনটা, ইন্টারন্যাশনাল ক্রাইমস ট্রাইব্যুনালস অ্যাক্ট 1973। ওখানে আমরা যে ঢুকালাম কিভাবে করলাম। প্রথম কথা হচ্ছে গিয়ে আমরা আমাদের যে মানে জিনিসটা কি, আপনি যদি এখন সারা পৃথিবীব্যাপী যে সিস্টেম অফ জাস্টিস, এটাকে বলা হয় কমপ্লিমেন্টারি সিস্টেম অফ জাস্টিস আর কি। মানে যেমন ধরেন একদিকে আইসিসি আছে, এ আছে, সে আছে। এখন আমাদের ওই অ্যাক্ট তো অনেক পুরানো অ্যাক্ট, কিন্তু আমাদের এটা তো আমাদের ডোমেস্টিক আইন, এটা তো আমাদের এমপিরা, আমাদের ল মেকার এই আইন বানিয়েছে। মানে এটা কিন্তু একটা সিম্পল একটা সভরেনিটির ইস্যু। আমাদের ল মেকাররা তাদের বিবেচনা খাটিয়ে জেনোসাইড কনভেনশনের হিস্ট্রি, ড্রাফটিং হিস্ট্রি দেখে পড়ে শুনে ইউনাইটেড নেশনস জেনারেল অ্যাসেম্বলির যে রেজলিউশন ছিল সেটা দেখে তারা বিবেচনা করেছে যে হ্যাঁ, আমাদের ডেফিনেশন অফ জেনোসাইডে আমরা পলিটিক্যাল গ্রুপ রাখবো। এটা কিন্তু খুব কোনো কমপ্লিকেটেড, এটা তারা রাখতে পারে, এটার মধ্যে কোনো বেআইনি কিছু কিন্তু নাই। এবং আমি বলছি না যে আপনি সেটা ভাবছেন, আমি জাস্ট নিজে ক্ল্যারিফাই করছি আর কি, যে এটা খুব স্বাভাবিক। একটা সভারেন স্টেট এবং যখন তারা ল পাস করবে, তারা তাদের নিজস্ব বুদ্ধি বিবেচনা নানা কিছুকে কাজে লাগিয়ে তারা রেখেছে। এবং দেখেন এটা কতটা প্রযোজ্য আমাদের জন্য। যেখানে আমরা জানি যে পাকিস্তান আর্মি একদম টার্গেটেড কিলিং করতেছে, সেটা আওয়ামী লীগ বলেন, নেতাকর্মী বলেন, ছাত্র নেতা বলেন, যেটাই বলেন, সেখানে তো তাহলে তো বোঝা যাচ্ছে যে পাকিস্তান সেনাবাহিনী সদস্যের চোখে ওরা হচ্ছে একটা আইডেন্টিফায়েবল গ্রুপ। যেমন হিন্দু একটা আইডেন্টিফায়েবল গ্রুপ, তুমি আওয়ামী লীগ করো, তুমি একটা আইডেন্টিফায়েবল গ্রুপের মধ্যে, তাহলে তো তোমাকে প্রোটেক্ট করতে হবে। এই বিবেচনাগুলিতেই কিন্তু তারা এটা করলো আর কি, এই আর কি।
আচ্ছা, আর কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন আছে কি?
I would like to ask a quick question. So basically, the last known biggest massacre or genocidal massacre that occurred, basically to our knowledge, is the Rohingya Crisis. And there are distinct similarities between the Rohingya Crisis, the Rohingya Genocide, and the Genocide of 1971. As a matter of fact, there have been a lot of works that showed us that just because India took us in during the 1971 genocide in Bangladesh, we should take the Rohingya people in because it's a similar genocide. So, but then again, the official phrase that is used is ethnic cleansing. So, like, what is the difference between the genocide of 1971 and the genocide of the Rohingya people in 2017 that make this differentiation so clear to people, or that make this differentiation as a whole? Like, why is it ethnic cleansing and not a genocide?
Well, first of all, I don't necessarily think we need to absolutely agree with those who are saying that this is just ethnic cleansing. আমরা যারা বলছে তাদের নিশ্চয় একটা পার্সপেক্টিভ আছে, আমি তাদের পার্সপেক্টিভকে খাটো করতে চাচ্ছি না, কিন্তু just because someone has said যে এটা ethnic cleansing এবং genocide না, we don't necessarily have to agree with that point of view. আপনি যদি রোহিঙ্গাদেরকে নিয়ে যেটা হচ্ছে, সেখানে মায়ানমারের যে মিলিটারি জান্টা, তারা যেভাবে ওদেরকে আসলে টার্গেটেড ওয়েতে তাদেরকে ডিপোর্ট করছে, তাদেরকে রেপ করছে, তাদেরকে খুন করছে, there is absolutely no reason why we cannot classify the atrocities against the Rohingyas as genocide. This is my personal opinion. Okay, so coming back to your question, why do some people say that it's ethnic cleansing and not genocide? Maybe they do it to try to tone it down. কারণ genocide wordটা তো আসলে একটা ধাক্কা খাওয়ার মতো word, যে genocide এর কথা মনে হলে we think about Rwanda, genocide এর কথা চিন্তা করলে we think about Bangladesh, genocide এর কথা চিন্তা করলে we think of the Jewish extermination, তাই না? মানে এগুলো তো বিশাল বিশাল ঘটনা আর কি। তাহলে এটাকে ডাউন প্লে করার হতে পারে, আমি I cannot be definitively sure, but এটা হতে পারে যে they're really trying to downplay. That's যে এটা জেনোসাইড হয় না, অন্য কিছু হয়েছে আর কি, perhaps, but I cannot be certain. But my point is simple: just because someone is saying that it's ethnic cleansing doesn't necessarily mean we have to agree with that point of view.
We will receive one last question.
Hello.
For the speaker.
Hello. Hello.
Siam. Bolin.
Yep.
First of all, thank you for this very intriguing session on 1971. I would just like to hear your opinion. You talked about Jamaat Islami and how Ghulam Azam publicly praised the Al-Badr and Al-Shams back in 1971. So I would like, as you're a 1971 expert legally, and I would like to know, we all know there were thousands of legal and political factors why Jamaat Islami, during the post-liberation war period, why the Jamaat Islami rose to power. But I would like, as a 1971 expert, I would like to know what's your opinion, why they rose to power, and why still to this day, why do they have a huge public support in this region? Though we fought a bloody war with Pakistan, but they have been publicly supportive of the Pakistan government back then. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, একটা বিষয় আমি হয়তো একটু মানে একদম স্পষ্টভাবে দ্বিমত পোষণ করতে হবে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে you're saying যে they enjoy a lot of popular support in Bangladesh. আমার কাছে কিন্তু সেটা আসলে মনে হয় না আর কি। মানে আজকে যদি ইলেকশন হয়, জামাত তো মানে জামাতের যে, আচ্ছা হ্যাঁ, মানে রিসেন্টলি আমাদের ইলেকশন নিয়ে অনেক কন্টেস্টেড ভিউজ আছে, বাট আপনি যদি আরেকটু পিছনে যান, টেক আ লুক এট দি 2008 ইলেকশনস ফর ইনস্ট্যান্স, যেটা নিয়ে আসলে কারো মনে কোনো সন্দেহ থাকা উচিত না। ওখানে তো জামাত কয়টা সিট পাইলো, 2টা বা 3টা না কি জানি, মানে এর বেশি তো আসলে সেজন্য ইন টার্মস অফ ইলেকটোরাল সাপোর্ট, ইন টার্মস অফ পপুলার সাপোর্ট, জামাতের তো আসলে সেটা নাই। এবং আপনি যদি আরো পিছনে যান, আপনি যদি 1971 সালের কথাতেও আসেন, ধরেন আমাদের যে নির্বাচন যেটা হলো, রাইট, যেটাতে আওয়ামী লীগ এতগুলি সিট পেলো, মানে ওভারওয়েলমিং মেজরিটি পেলো, সেখানেও দেখেন জামাতের আসলে কিন্তু কোনো অস্তিত্বই নাই। তাহলে দ্য কোয়েশ্চেন ইজ, আমার মনে হয় আপনি একটা ভালো একটা পয়েন্ট টাচ অন করছেন। ইট মে বি দ্যাট ইউ ওয়ান্ট এবল টু আর্টিকুলেট ইট প্রপারলি। আমার কাছে মনে হয় যে যেটা পারহ্যাপস, আপনি কারেক্ট মি ইফ আই এম রং, মেবি ইউ আর আস্কিং যে why are they still so powerful? মানে
and especially
আমার কাছে ওদেরকে পপুলার মনে হয়, হ্যাঁ, স্পেশালি ফাইন্যান্সিয়ালি, বাট why are they so powerful? দেখেন এখন সেটার, তাহলে আপনি যদি বাংলাদেশের হিস্ট্রিটাও দেখেন, ধরেন আপনি যদি মুক্তিযুদ্ধে ফেরত আসেন, হ্যাঁ, একদিকে মনে করেন মিলিয়ন, মানে 10 মিলিয়ন রেফিউজি চলে গেছে ইন্ডিয়ার বর্ডার ক্রস করে ইন্ডিয়াতে, মুক্তি বাহিনী মাত্র মানে অর্গানাইজ হচ্ছে আর কি, যুদ্ধে আমরা যাচ্ছি আর কি। এখন ওই মুহূর্তগুলিতে তো ডেফিনেটলি পাকিস্তান আর্মি খুবই পাওয়ারফুল, এটা তো অস্বীকার করার কোনো উপায় নেই, একটা অকল্পনীয় রকমের পাওয়ারফুল একটা আর্মি। এখন জামাতে ইসলামী তারা মাইনরিটি, ছোট, কিন্তু তারা আবার তাদের ক্যাডার আছে, তারা অর্গানাইজড, তারা খুব অর্গানাইজড আর কি। তারা ভেবেছে যে হ্যাঁ, এদের সাথে আমরা থাকি, কারণ আমরা আমাদের যে ইথস, আমাদের যে ফিলসফি, এদের সাথে পাকিস্তান আর্মিটা মিলে যাচ্ছে, আমরা পাকিস্তানের ইউনিটি রাখতে চাই, এটা হচ্ছে অন্তত একটা জিনিস। এবং তারপরে তো ক্রাইম করতে চাইছেন তো আছেই আর কি। তাহলে আপনি যখন এত বড় একটা পাওয়ারফুল এন্টিটির সাথে যখন সাইড করবেন, তখন তো you will get funds, you will get money, you will get patronage, you will get support. তাহলে ওভাবে শুরু হলো। কিন্তু তারপরে ধরেন দেশ স্বাধীন হলো, আমাদের একটা বিচার প্রক্রিয়া চলছে, জামাতের লোকজন একটু দৌড়ের উপরে আছে, কিন্তু তারপরে আপনি যদি মিড 1970s এ আসেন, বঙ্গবন্ধুকে খুন করে ফেলা হলো, এবং তখন ধরেন জিয়া রহমান ক্ষমতায় আসলো। এবং এটা তো, এগুলি তো একদম বেসিক ফ্যাক্ট। আপনি যদি ডিসেম্বর 1975 এ যান, ডিসেম্বর 1975, আপনি যদি যে সরকারি যদি নির্দেশটা দেখেন যে কিভাবে আমাদের কোলাবোরেটরস অর্ডারে বিচারাধীন যে যারা ছিলেন সবাইকে জেল থেকে বের করে দেওয়া হলো, এটা কে করছে? ডিসেম্বর 1975 এ ক্ষমতায় কে? জিয়া রহমান ছাড়া তো অন্য কেউ তো আর না। এখন তারপরে যদি আপনি আরো আগান, তাহলে জিয়ার আমল, এরশাদের আমল, মানে প্যাট্রোনেজ যেটাকে বলে, যে আপনি জিজ্ঞেস করতেছেন যে ওরা কিভাবে এত ক্ষমতাবান হলো, এত টাকা পাইলো কিভাবে। রাষ্ট্রীয় পৃষ্ঠপোষকতা যখন একটা দল পাবে, তারা হবে না, তারা তাদেরকে কত জায়গায় তাদেরকে অ্যাপয়েন্টমেন্ট দেওয়া হয়েছে, চাকরি দেওয়া হয়েছে, সেনাবাহিনীতে ঢুকানো হয়েছে, সচিব বানানো হয়েছে, কোথায় তারা ছিল না। সেই জন্য এরকম যখন রাষ্ট্রীয়, হ্যাঁ, এইভাবে যখন পৃষ্ঠপোষকতা দেওয়া হয় তখন তো তাদের উত্থান তো হবেই আর কি। সেটার রেশ এখনো কাটে নাই আর কি, সেটা এখনো আছে।
আমাদের আসলে সেশনটা শেষ করতে হবে। থ্যাংক ইউ সো মাচ ডক্টর সঞ্জীব হোসেন আমাদের সাথে যুক্ত হওয়ার জন্য। And we hope that in our upcoming events and activities we will be having you also.
I would
And
love to. I would love to.
for the participants, thank you so much for joining both the sessions.